Hello everyone and welcome to today's video. Today I'm talking about the 2026 US Senate elections, and we're going to be going over the 5 ways that Democrats could potentially flip the Senate from Republican control to Democratic control. So without further ado, let's take a look at the Senate map, where Democrats start out with 34 Senate seats, Republicans 31, with 35 Senate seats that are up in 2026. Now, I am adding in this video the independent category here because I think the independent candidates that are running may play a potential role in helping the Democrats get the Senate majority. So first things first, let's go through the states that we know are going to be safe for both the Democrats and Republicans. We know these states aren't going to flip really no matter what, and we can essentially just write these off of really being competitive. You could put Oregon, Colorado, New Mexico in this category for the Democrats, Illinois as well, with Virginia, Delaware, New Jersey, Rhode Island, and Massachusetts. This gets the Democrats up to 43 Senate seats that are going to be 100% safe Democrat. For the Republicans, they're going to be safe Republican in Idaho, Wyoming, South Dakota, Oklahoma, Arkansas, Louisiana, Alabama, Tennessee, Kentucky, West Virginia. And you could probably stop it there. There's a few states that are pretty close being safe Republican that I want to discuss a little bit more in depth, but Republicans will certainly get up to about 41 Senate seats. This leaves about 16 races that are currently uncalled. Now, what are these seats actually going to be in terms of competitiveness is still TBD. But a few states that we have a pretty good idea, like Mississippi, this is Cindy Hyde-Smith's Senate seat. She won it by about 10 points in 2020. It is possible it could be more competitive, but it'd probably still be more than a 5-point Republican victory, which would put it in likely Republican in between 5 and 15%. South Carolina, with the passing of Lindsey Graham, makes this race a little bit more interesting, as the Democrat Annie Andrews is waiting to see who her opponent will be, but again, likely going to be likely Republican in between 5 and 15%. Ashley Moody's Senate race in the state of Florida, I think you can make a pretty similar argument for it being in that category. Maybe Alex Vindman can make the race more competitive, but we're still probably going to see an over 5-point margin of victory in that state. If Democrats' path to winning the Senate involves them winning Florida, the chances of them doing so in 2026 probably are not all that strong. So yeah, Florida I would add in that category. For now, Kansas I would also put in that category. This is Democrat Adam Hamilton running against Roger Marshall, the Republican incumbent senator. There was a internal poll showing that if Hamilton ran as an independent, he was leading by 2. As a Democrat, he was trailing by about 8. So when you account for the bias of the poll, you're probably looking around like a 12 to a 13-point deficit for Hamilton in Kansas, but Kansas has shown history before of being a very competitive race during the midterm elections, especially on the governor's side, and we're likely going to see a close governor's race again in 2026. So there is the potential that Kansas could ultimately be competitive and everything is said and done, but for now, I'd throw it as likely Republican. Now, the state of Minnesota, whether it's Peggy Flanagan or Angie Craig, is still to be determined, but Minnesota should be going into likely Democrat against Michelle Tafoya in all likelihood in the general election. In a more Democratic friendly election environment, it probably won't be a 15-point Democratic win, but the Democrats should still win Minnesota by more than 5 points, under 15 points. Minnesota you could put as likely Democrat for now. So the seats, there are currently 11 Senate races that are right now uncalled on the 2026 Senate map. The only difference here is that I'm throwing in the state of Montana, which I usually wouldn't do because independent candidates there could play a potential role in the Democrats flipping the Senate. So for the purpose of today's video, we're going to put the remainder seats in the quote-unquote toss-up category. This is where you could argue the Senate map could really begin. Now, again, I'm sure if you're a Democrat, you'll say, well, maybe Kansas or South Carolina or Florida or Mississippi should be included in that. Republicans may argue that Minnesota should be included in that, but most of the consensus rankings would probably start right around here. So let's get some of the first ones out of the way. The Democrats on the seat of the 11 toss-ups have 2 Democratic races they're defending here. Well, actually more than 2, but 2 very important swing ones in Georgia with Jon Ossoff, Gary Peters in Michigan. Jeanne Shaheen is retiring in New Hampshire, and this is going to be Chris Pappas, the Democrat representative, in this race. So really there are 3, but 2 of which get, I would say, more of the attention in Georgia and Michigan, even though competitive-wise, that's a whole different conversation. Republicans have the rest. They have about 8 Senate seats that they're defending, and outside of North Carolina and Maine, they're all in states that Donald Trump won by more than 5 points in 2024, which is why the Democratic math to flipping the Senate is going to be difficult. But for the Democrats, the video is on how can the Democrats flip the Senate and what are some ways they can do it. First things first, the Democrats have to hold Georgia, where Jon Ossoff is the incumbent U.S. Senator. Now, the good news for the Democrats, and we can pull up here, this is the Maine governor election. We're going to pull up the Senate election from 2026 in the state of Georgia. The good news for the Democrats is Jon Ossoff so far seems to be on his way to likely holding this race against Republican Representative Mike Collins. Based on the general election rankings, only a few of them now have it as toss-up. Most have it in the direction of Jon Ossoff. Most have it as a lean Democrat. The early polling thus far, though, has actually shown Jon Ossoff leading by about a likely Democratic margin of about 7.5%. I do expect it will narrow up at least a little bit in the coming months, but a new poll from Fabrizio Ward and Impact Research shows that Jon Ossoff at 52%, Collins at 43%. So for now, we're going to put the state of Georgia in the Democratic column for the sake of this argument. Next, you got to talk about the state of New Hampshire. We'll go to New Hampshire next. This is U.S. Representative Chris Pappas, who's running to keep Jeanne Shaheen's Senate seat in Democratic hands. He'll likely be facing off against former Republican U.S. Senator John E. Sununu in the general election, and it's kind of in a similar spot to Georgia. Most of the rankings have it either tilt or lean Democrat. Pappas versus Sununu, looking to be a close race. Pappas is currently up about 4.6%, so the polling here is actually closer than Georgia currently is. There's still a good amount of undecided, though, and that's what really makes things more interesting here, is roughly the 11% of voters that are currently undecided. When things shake out, we're probably going to see around like a 5.5 to a 6-point margin of victory. That would put New Hampshire as likely Democrat. So Democrats already are at 46 Senate seats. The last one they have to hold is the state of Michigan, where Abdul El-Sayed is looking to be in a primary fight against Haley Stevens. It's very close where things currently stand in that primary. In my most recent election night prediction for this race, I had Abdul El-Sayed as the Democrat most likely to win that primary, but it's certainly very close, and we're going to have to wait and see how it all plays out, but I think Abdul El-Sayed is favored as of right now. For the general election, it's going to be a very close race. Technically, a majority of the rankings have it listed as toss-up, and for Rogers versus Abdul El-Sayed, after the most recent poll from Glengarriff Group, has Mike Rogers up about 2.1% in the average, whereas against Haley Stevens, Stevens is narrowly up. Though, like with New Hampshire, the undecided vote is going to play an important role here. Roughly about 12% of the vote is undecided. But for today's video, we're going to say it stays under 5 points, but Abdul El-Sayed narrowly finds a way to win. This gets the Democrats to the 47 Senate seats that they currently have now. So by holding Georgia, Michigan, and New Hampshire, it basically means the Democrats aren't going to lose any seats in this cycle. The question is, can the Democrats win the Senate, and if they do, where? The first seat that everyone's going to talk about pretty much automatically is the state of North Carolina. Now, if you're unfamiliar, North Carolina, the Republican incumbent Tom Tillis is retiring. The primaries have already been settled. Republican former RNC chair Michael Whatley is the Republican candidate. But the Democrats have fielded a candidate in Roy Cooper, the former governor of North Carolina, who gives the Democrats a very strong chance at flipping this state and giving them a Democratic win here for the first time since I want to say the former senator that lost to Tom Tillis, Kay Hagan, won her Senate race, I believe in 2008, on the same ballot that Barack Obama, won the presidential race in North Carolina. Now the polling, again, 10.4% undecided, so still a good amount of undecideds, but Roy Cooper is currently leading by about 8.4% in the polling averages, including a new New York Times Siena University poll from not too long ago in June showing it a 7-point race. So it may narrow up as we get closer to Election Day, but Roy Cooper is narrowly leading. Roy Cooper winning North Carolina gives the Democrats, and I'll just put it in the tilt column for now. I'm going to dispatch with the usual margin of victories for under 5 points between lean and likely and tilt. We're going to put it in tilt now just so it stands out. But North Carolina certainly going to the Democrats is going to play a massive role in whether the Democrats can actually flip the U.S. Senate. So North Carolina would get Democrats up to 48. Then you have to go to Maine in the Susan Collins Senate race as the Democrats' next most likely pickup to flipping the U.S. Senate. Because it's hard to envision a scenario where the Democrats win back the Senate if Maine is not going blue. Now that we officially know, Troy Jackson's been nominated by the Democrats to replace Graham Plattner in the general election. The general election race is officially on, and again, most of the rankings have it listed as toss-up in this race. The polling right now, only been 4 polls, including a University of New Hampshire poll, which came out between July 15th and 20th, and Troy Jackson's currently leading over Susan Collins, 47.8 to 46%, and the average, 1.8% lead for Jackson with 6 points or so undecided. Maine utilizes ranked choice voting, so in Maine the magic number is 50%. You have to break 50% of the vote or ranked choice voting is utilized, and right now in the poll, no poll has shown Jackson or Collins breaking 50% yet. We saw very similar polling numbers back in 2020, where Collins ultimately shocked and ended up winning, but we'll have to wait and see how this race goes. For the purpose of today's video, again, we're going to put Maine as a tilt Democratic flip here. This gets the Democrats to 49. So now the question is going to be, how do the Democrats get the majority? Because if they get to 50, Vice President J.D. Vance, as the Vice President, you are the President of the Senate, technically breaks all ties. So Vance alone means the Democrats have to get to 51 Senate seats in 2026 to actually have the majority. So what's the next most likely flip? Well, this is where things get interesting here. Outside of North Carolina and Maine, I would say most political analysts would attest those are the most likely flip opportunities for the Democrats. Also worth noting that Maine is the only state Donald Trump lost to Kamala Harris that currently has a Republican U.S. Senator. In North Carolina, with Roy Cooper running in that race, gives the Democrats a very strong candidate. The rest of these states all voted for Donald Trump, I believe, by 10 points or more in 2024. So now it's going to be interesting to see what path is the most likely to flip after this one. And there's a few contenders here. I think first we'll start with the state of Ohio, where this is a Senate race that was formerly J.D. Vance's Senate seat that he gave up to become Vice President of the United States. Former Republican Lieutenant Governor John Husted was appointed by the governor of Ohio to serve in the seat, and they're running for the remainder of J.D. Vance's term, which will be expiring in 2028. So whoever wins this race is going to have to run again for re-election in 2 years. But he's facing off against former U.S. Senator Sherrod Brown, who just lost his re-election attempt in 2024 to Bernie Moreno and was ultimately a very close race. Most of the rankings are a toss-up for this race in Ohio, and the polling has been very close. Sherrod Brown is currently leading by 1.3% over Husted. Though the most recent poll from the middle of June from New York Times and Siena University shows Husted leading over Brown by 3 points. Still a very close race, under the margin of error if you're skewing it in the direction of Sherrod Brown. So definitely a tight one underway. Again, the undecided vote, 5.3%, likely going to make the difference in this one as well. But given how close Ohio was, where it voted for Trump by 11 points in 2024, but the Senate election, Moreno only won by 3.6. Tell me if you heard these numbers before. 50% to about 46 to 47% shows another close race underway in the state of Ohio, but maybe in a more favorable election environment for Democrats, Sherrod Brown can find a way to win and flip the state to the Democratic side. Big if, but I would say probably the third most likely Senate seat to flip in the cycle. So now the Democrats are at 50. Now that means for the Democrats to win the Senate, probably going to have to win one of Montana, Nebraska, Iowa, Texas, or Alaska. And this is where we talk about the videos of the 5 different ways to flip the Senate. I think you start here. These remaining 5 toss-up seats, I think these are the 5 different scenarios for how the Democrats do it. Because it's possible the Democrats could win the Senate without winning Ohio, but I really, when you look at it, it's hard to imagine Ohio going red and then seeing like Iowa or Montana or Nebraska or Texas or Alaska, like half of these going blue. I really don't see it's a very realistic scenario. We can play through that scenario later in the video, but I think it starts with Ohio, North Carolina, and Maine all going blue. What happens next? This is where the first scenario starts, and we're going to go with the state of Alaska. Alaska is a special Senate race where it's Republican Dan Sullivan, but he's facing off against a very strong Democratic candidate in Mary Peltola, the former representative of Alaska's congressional district at large from 2022 to the 2024 election, where she ultimately lost a very close race. She lost to Nick Begich, the Republican, only by 2 points on the initial round. Alaska, like Maine, utilizes ranked choice voting, but Peltola still got 46.37% of the vote. So she actually got a larger share of the vote in her race than Sherrod Brown did, 46.47 to 46.37. So she actually got 0.1% less than Sherrod Brown, but very similar in terms of the overall numbers. Then back in 2022, she defeated Sarah Palin by about 10 points in that election. So Peltola, similar to Sherrod Brown, is a uniquely qualified Democratic candidate for the Senate race in 2026 and gives the Democrats a real chance at winning here. Most of the rankings have it listed as a toss-up. And Peltola currently leads 0.4%. New York Times Siena University poll has Sullivan at 47%, Peltola at 45%, with still 5% of the vote undecided. So another race that's looking to be very, very close between Sullivan and Peltola, and that's good news for the Democrats. If the Democrats can find a way to win Alaska, they're probably doing very well in winning North Carolina and Maine, just when you compare this state, how red it is compared to some of these other states. And if Alaska goes blue, this gets the Democrats to 51 Senate seats and would give the Democrats Senate control, and we haven't even talked about any of the other states yet. So Alaska is certainly one of those states that can give the Democrats the Senate control. And we'll revisit this later in the video about if Ohio stays red, can the Democrats still win the Senate without it? Yes. But in this scenario, I think the Democrats' most likely path to winning back the Senate is flipping North Carolina, flipping Maine, flipping Ohio, and then flipping Alaska. This is, I think, the Democrats' best path and the most likely one right now. And the strength of their candidates in these states, I think, is a large reason why. Troy Jackson, at this current point in time, is still kind of untested, but he's probably or definitely going to be stronger than Graham Plattner now, given Plattner's scandals. But Roy Cooper, Sherrod Brown, and Mary Peltola have all been tested at the state level before and are all extremely strong candidates for the Democrats in this election environment. Troy Jackson, again, could end up being like that, still TBD, but those three candidates in Alaska, North Carolina, and Ohio have been battle tested and are very strong Democratic candidates. So I think this is the most likely path to the Democrats winning the Senate majority. Now, let's go through one of the other scenarios, and it involves the state of Texas. We're going to keep Ohio as tilt for the Democrats. We can honestly swap out Ohio for Alaska if you really want to, but I think Ohio will leave it there for now. Let's talk about Texas with James Talarico versus Ken Paxton, because this is a race that Republicans would typically be winning by a pretty decent amount, but their candidate and their candidate quality with Ken Paxton is certainly not as strong in the general election as for current Republican incumbent John Cornyn. Now for Talarico versus Paxton, Talarico definitely I would argue is the more stronger candidate in this race, where even 4 of the rankings have it listed as toss-up in the state of Texas. Now Talarico and Paxton have a lot of undecided votes, still 10% of the vote undecided, but Talarico does currently have a lead of 1.3% across the polling margins right now, including that New York Times Siena University poll, which showed the race tied at 47-47 between Paxton and Talarico. Now, close Senate races in Texas are not a foreign concept. 2024, Ted Cruz won his Senate race against Colin Allred by about 8.5%. Still not a massive margin, though, considering Donald Trump won the state of Texas by about 13.7% on the same ballot. But then back in 2018, in that Donald Trump first term midterm, Ted Cruz only defeated Beto O'Rourke by 2.6%. And if Ken Paxton's arguably a weaker candidate than Ted Cruz, which I would argue he certainly is, we see why this race is shaping up to be very close, one that James Talarico may be able to eke out a narrow victory. So the second path that I think involves the Democrats winning the Senate control has them winning North Carolina and Maine, flipping Ohio, and then the state of Texas with James Talarico defeating Ken Paxton could also give the Democrats the Senate majority. Now, this would be a very seismic win for the Democrats, as Democrats have been longing to win the state of Texas for a very long time at the Senate level, at the governor level. It hasn't happened yet, even though 2018 did come very close against Ken Paxton. James Talarico could potentially pull off the upset and win the state. Again, I don't know if it's the most likely path to the Democrats winning the Senate. I think Alaska is probably more likely to flip than Texas is, but Texas, I think, is definitely up there as a potential flip opportunity for the Democrats in that state. So path number 2, I think, involves the state of Texas going to the Democrats. Now we'll go to the next path, path number 3, and this is the state of Iowa. Iowa's an interesting Senate race as the Republican incumbent Joni Ernst is retiring. Now, this is a case where I think Ernst being replaced by U.S. Representative Ashley Hinson after she won the primary. I would argue that Hinson actually has a better chance at winning the Senate race than Joni Ernst would, but that has not stopped it from becoming a competitive race. Most of the rankings do have it listed as lean Republican for the general election, where Hinson's facing off against Democrat Josh Turek, but it's still been very close. Hinson's at 47% in the race to the White House polling average. Josh Trueck's at 46.2%, still 7% of the vote undecided, but it's currently an under 1 point race. The New York Times Siena University poll that we've been using in this video only shows Hinson up by about 2, but still 5% undecided. Now we know we've fallen for traps on Iowa's polling before. Iowa's polling can be historically unreliable, but in the most recent Fox News poll, Turek is leading over Hinson by about 4 points. Josh Turek, as of the time of recording this video, was also just endorsed by President Obama in the state today. And obviously Barack Obama, Iowa sparked his presidential campaign, gave him his first win in the 2008 Democratic primary. Democrats could be having a resurgence in the state of Iowa, given President Trump's approval ratings and on things like the economy and on farming, two very big issues for the state of Iowa. Iowa could present the Democrats an opportunity to flip the Senate race to the Democratic side, and if they could do so with winning Ohio, North Carolina, and Maine, this would get the Democrats to 51 Senate seats. And if you want to call into question and say, well, the Republicans may hold on and win the state of Ohio, well, if you want to throw one of Texas or Alaska into this category, this could be another path for the Democrats to win the Senate. If they can win Iowa and win Alaska, they can even get there without winning the state of Ohio. So Iowa, as a state, it used to be a Democratic state in the Obama era, and then in the Trump era, it's become more of a likely Republican state. If the Democrats could find a way to win the Senate race, and I think Rob Sand and Josh Turek, the Democratic governor and Senate candidates, quite frankly, are very strong, and I think both of them are very capable of winning those races. If the Democrats could find a way to do so, it would put Iowa on the map as maybe another target for the Democrats in 2028, and it would definitely give the Democrats a strong chance of flipping the Senate in 2026 if they could find a way to swing that. So Iowa is certainly a top target for the Democrats. Next, so we talked about Iowa, we talked about Texas, we talked about Alaska as three paths as Democrat candidates. Then we come to Montana and Nebraska, and this is where the independent candidates are going to have to be called into question here. Where in Nebraska, a Republican versus a Democratic race, like with Montana, probably wouldn't be too close. Montana maybe a little bit more due to John Tester being the former U.S. Senator. But for Nebraska, we're seeing a rematch in terms of the independent candidate Dan Osborne running in this race. Pete Ricketts, the Republican U.S. Senator, ran on the same ballot in 2024, but in a different Senate race, where in Nebraska, Pete Ricketts won his special election against a Democrat by 25 points. But for Deb Fischer versus Dan Osborne, Osborne only lost to Fischer by 6.7% in a year that Republicans did very well across the country. Expecting a more Democratic-friendly election environment, Dan Osborne is certainly in the realm of potentially being able to flip this race against the Republican incumbent, Pete Ricketts. Now, make no mistake, the Republican Ricketts is definitely still favored in this race. Most of the rankings have him as either likely or lean Republican. But the early polling data, they've only come from Democratic internal pollsters, but they've shown a tight race. Even the polls that have Osborne up, probably, once you account for the bias of the poll, probably is like a tied race, but still a good amount of undecideds. But still, a very close race and typically a very safe, reliable state. What if there's a big enough swing in the election environment that Dan Osborne finds a way to win and defeat Pete Ricketts in this race? This would have the Democrats at 50 Senate seats, Republicans 45, one senator that is a quote-unquote independent. Now, we know there are currently two independents in the U.S. Senate, and Bernie Sanders from Vermont and Angus King from Maine. Now, Angus King, I would argue, there's not even argue, I know for a fact, is the more moderate of the two, but he does caucus with the Democratic Party, whereas Bernie Sanders is an independent because he believes the Democratic Party is not far left enough, but still, most of the time, despite not being a Democrat himself, he caucuses with the Democrats and votes with the Democrats like 100% of the time. Dan Osborne, being from the state of Nebraska, would be a lot more interesting. He'd probably break with the Democrats and vote more for a lot of issues, typically more aligned with the Republican side than most, but he could say, I'm going to caucus with the Democrats and give them that deciding vote and giving them the 51 Senate seat majority if Nebraska was able to swing there. So that could definitely be a very interesting scenario where Nebraska could ultimately decide with whether the Senate is a Democratic or Republican majority. It is possible Osborne could decide to truly stay neutral and not caucus with the Democrats or the Republicans, and then literally every single Senate bill would go through him and what he decides to do. As a power move, he definitely could do that. But for this video, there is a possibility Osborne could ultimately decide whether the Senate is a Democrat or Republican control. Now, the state of Montana, I think you could argue could fit in the same category. This Senate race in Montana involves Republican Kurt Alme, who's looking to replace U.S. Senator Steve Daines, who at the last minute decided he's not seeking another term. Now, what's interesting about this race is there is a Democrat in the race, an Alani Bankhead, and independent Seth Bodnar. Now, I mentioned earlier Jon Tester, who ran for re-election in 2024 and lost to Republican Tim Sheehy by 7.1%. So against just one Democrat in this race, we'd probably see a Senate race that's not really too competitive. It would still probably be under 15 points, but the Republican Kurt Alme would probably win relatively handedly. On the Democratic side, though, Jon Tester, the former U.S. Senator, has not endorsed Alani Bankhead. Instead, he threw his support behind the independent candidate, who is the former University of Montana, and in Seth Bodnar. Now, this race is listed. Consensus is a little murky in between solid, likely, and lean Republican, but most agree that the Republican Alme has a lead here. And the polling data, it shows that Kurt Alme has roughly about a 20-point lead over Bankhead and Bodnar, for a large reason being Alani Bankhead and Seth Bodnar are splitting the opposition vote. Now, many in the consensus rankings have shown this, that Bankhead dropping out and supporting Bodnar would give the best chance of Alme losing this race ultimately. And I think they have some of these matchups on here. No, they don't. I thought they may have one for Alme versus just Bankhead, but maybe it's included in the cross tabs of some of these polls. Yeah, I guess they don't have it anymore. I swear they used to, but anyway, look at this most recent poll from the Democratic pollster Tavern Research. Alme at 49, Bankhead 24, Bodnar 25. Combine the vote here, 24 and 25, you're at about 49% of the vote, a tied race with Alme. Now, does that mean every single one of those voters would go against the Republican? Statistically, that just doesn't really happen. It'd probably be at least 1 or 2% would go towards Alme. It's kind of the same math of when Andrew Cuomo was trying to stop Zohran Mamdani. And he's like, he literally needs every single undecided vote to break for him. And that just doesn't happen mathematically in elections. But there's enough vote out there to potentially catch him if some of his support maybe doesn't show up in the general. And then you can look at a prior poll as well. 41, 22, 27. That's 41 to about 29. So Bodnar and Bankhead are both blanking this opposition vote. And the best comparison we could see here was the Marco Rubio Senate race, not the 2016 one, I think it was the 2010 one, where Marco Rubio ended up getting about 49% of the vote. Independent at the time, Charlie Crist, got 29.71%. Democrat Kendrick Meek got 20.2%. Combining their vote, you're looking at roughly about 49.9% of the vote, which would have been more than the vote number that Marco Rubio got. Now, again, if that were the case, does that mean Rubio would have lost? We don't know for sure, because statistically that seems kind of unlikely, but it's possible. And you could argue in Montana the same thing, that if one of Bankhead or Bodnar dropped out, I would argue it's more likely that Bodnar staying in the race gives the Democrats a better chance of winning. I don't think Bankhead has a chance of really winning the Senate race. If Bankhead ultimately dropped out and it became a 1v1 of Alme versus Bodnar, it gives the Democrats a better chance, where at very least it'd be a very close race. I still think Alme would be slightly favored, but an independent in Montana has a better chance at winning with the backing of the Democrats than a Democratic candidate. Montana could potentially narrowly flip for the Democrats, and again, Seth Bodnar, who has the endorsement of the former Democratic senator, could probably caucus with the Democrats, and that could give the Democrats a 51-seat Senate majority. So those are just some paths. Those are 5 paths in Montana, Nebraska, Iowa, Texas, and Alaska, with Ohio being blue to get the Democrats to 51 Senate seats. You could swap out Ohio for, say, Alaska or Texas, but I think the simple reality is the Democratic Senate map in 2026 for how the Democrats flip the Senate, it starts with holding Georgia, Michigan, and New Hampshire, which I think the Democrats are favored in all 3 right now, but it's certainly no small feat given obviously the uncertainty in Michigan with Abdul El-Sayed, former U.S. Senator John Sununu in New Hampshire, and Jon Ossoff, who did nearly win in 2020. All 3, I would still argue, are favored for the Democrats right now. But the Democrats start with winning North Carolina and Maine and flipping those 2 Senate seats. I don't see really any path to the Democrats flipping the Senate if they don't flip North Carolina and Maine. And then they go on the attack in the 6 remaining states that are currently held by Republicans, and states Trump won by more than 10 points in 2024: Ohio, Iowa, Nebraska, Texas, Alaska, and Montana. That's ultimately how it breaks down. Those are the scenarios I've laid out for you. And you can get, obviously, creative. You don't have to give Ohio to the Democrats. You could say Ohio stays red. You could even say maybe Montana stays red. And then you could even throw some more in as well. Like, let's see here. Maybe Nebraska stays red in the Dan Osborne race. And then the Republicans are at 48. Democrats are at 49. Republicans could win one more. Maybe they hold on to Iowa. But then you can say Mary Peltola finds a way to win Alaska. And then Texas, Talarico, and Paxton comes down to the wire. Talarico wins. This is another path. It's possible, but usually in elections when we see things, everything kind of breaks one way or the other. So I don't know if this would happen, but it is technically possible. The only difference is Montana and Nebraska, I would argue, are way more Republican states at this point than, say, Alaska or Texas or Iowa are. So maybe it'd be more likely you would see Iowa and Ohio going blue as well if Texas and Alaska also did, which if this happened for the Democrats, where they got up to 53, Republicans are at 47, not only would that be great for the Democrats, but also help them going into 2028, where they're looking to flip Wisconsin and North Carolina then as well. So the Senate map for 2026, the Democrats, after looking at a map initially where you were talking about North Carolina and Maine as really the only real pickup opportunities, this map is very quickly delved into being a competitive election that the Democrats can certainly flip control of the Senate. The question will be ultimately, does it come to fruition? And if it does, by how much? But when you look through the paths here of the Senate races that are up, it's certainly possible that it could indeed ultimately happen once everything is said and done. I hope you enjoyed this video. I know this is definitely more of a longer one, but I hope you enjoyed it. Please remember to hit like and subscribe if you did, and you stay notified when I post more videos, which I do every single week. So I'd appreciate if you can hit like and subscribe and watch all of those. For now, that is it. Thank you so much for watching, and hope to see you in a future video. I hope you enjoyed watching this video. If you did, I really appreciate it if you could hit like and hit subscribe as well. It really helped me and my channel out a whole lot if you could do that for me. You can see in the circle on the top left the subscribe here button to subscribe to the channel. On the right, there are going to be two video pop-ups for you. My latest video will be on the top, and a recommended playlist by myself will be on the bottom as well. In the bottom left of the screen, you'll see my channel name, Anthony's Election Center, which you are currently watching. On my Facebook, Anthony.ElectionCenter is also there. And if you want to reach out to me on email, anthpredicts@gmail.com is my email. Feel free to pause the video if you need to. If you want to look for any of these, obviously in more time, please feel free. But for now, though, that is it. I really thank you all for watching and hope to see you in a future video.